As I was told, I will be talking about Hungary. I will be focusing on Hungary. And I will talk about two things basically, the rule of law and democracy. If you take a look on the basic facts, Hungary in the European Union, this country is a member of the European Union since 2004. I would say a reluctant member recently, because it doesn't look like it belongs to the European Union. It is a membership without sort of true feeling of belonging. Actually, this is how the government presents the Hungarian position within the European Union. The population has a different opinion. 2/3 of Hungarians actually like the European Union very much. So there is a sort of discrepancy between the government communication, which focuses on national war of independence, and the everyday experience of the population. European Union means, first of all, open borders, Erasmus fellowships, travels, education, and integration to the European values. The economic context is the post-economic crisis situation. There was a global financial crisis in 2008, and that made possible for this breakthrough, this big storm which occurred in 2010 in Hungary, that Fidesz, after 8 years of socialist liberal government, came to power, receiving 53% of the votes, but due to the disproportional system of the electoral law, receiving 2/3 majority in the parliament. The elections were free and fair in 2010. Unfortunately, we cannot say the same about the 2014 elections, which are widely seen as free and unfair. If you have questions, I can elaborate this later on. So, while in 2010 absolute majority was enough for a qualified majority in the parliament, in 2014, 45–44% of the votes was enough to have 2/3 of the seats in the parliament. So the Hungarian party system is a dominant, hegemonic party system. Basically, there is one party, a sort of state party, which dominates the political agenda. The opposition is fragmented, the left is fragmented, badly beaten, and still try to recover, while the far right is sort of emerging. There are speculations about the danger of Jobbik, whether it will be the dominant party of the future or not. It is still about 15 to 18%, 20% sometime. If you compare it to France, Front National, it is stronger. If you see Denmark or Austria, I would say there are democracies with a strong far-right party, but the center is unattached to the far-right ideas. There is a clear-cut division between the far-right and the center. And the problem in Hungary is exactly this, that this doesn't exist. There is an overlap in several aspects between Jobbik and Fidesz, and therefore the real problem in Hungary is not so much the existence of far-right, which might exist, as I said, in normal Western democracies, but actually the mainstreaming the extreme ideas. So with some irony, we would say that we have an extreme center, not an extreme right, and that makes democracy more vulnerable. So the direction of change is unfortunately negative since 2010. Hungary used to be a consolidated liberal democracy by all democracy measuring institutions. Actually, Freedom House considered it as a consolidated democracy until 2013. Now the recent results suggest that it is still free, but it is downgraded a little bit in terms of political rights and civil liberties. So a group of people, political and economic entrepreneurs, capture the state occupy the state from inside, and the process is a sort of hollowing out a liberal democracy from inside. It's a very interesting phenomenon. as a political scientist, I follow this process with great interest, but as a citizen of the country, I am less happy with this procedure. So it seems like there is something new, a mixed hybrid regime. We don't know the end of the story. So what are the conceptual pillars of the Orban regime? In my second slide, it is interesting to see that we don't say usually that Orban government, we say Orban regime. So after the name of the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban is the Prime Minister of Hungary, and everybody talks about Orban regime, which indicates that it is more than just a government. This is fundamentally different from the previous. So what are the pillars? Centralized power. There is a very high personalization of politics. The media is controlled by the state, and actually the party is Fidesz, the dominant party. It's not a classic political party, this is a state party. So the Fidesz doesn't have an independent life outside the Prime Minister's office. It is directed from the Prime Minister. So it's more like a state party than just a normal democratic political party. It is a boss democracy, if it is democracy at all. So it is very hard to identify any sort of ideology because the Prime Minister declared that the ideology is over, so the age of ideology expired, and he is going to continue a very pragmatic political line, sort of opportunism, primacy of power politics, and end of ideology. Nevertheless, we can identify some sort of strong nationalism and wrapping it in populism, selling it in a populistic discourse. There is a homogenized concept of nation. So nation is not seen as a political community, but more like a homogeneous ethnic community. But it is also inconsequential. Sometimes it's used with a double standard. There is a difference between the Roma and the non-Roma components of the Hungarian nation, or those who are living in the former pre-Trianon Hungarian territories, and those who are actually left the country and now living in London or Berlin or Vienna. Those are different Hungarians. So you know, making differentiating among Hungarians indicates that even ethno-nationalism is used in an instrumental way. Again, social exclusion is an important feature of the regime. The Hungarian society was never really very solidaristic. In the Kádár era, János Kádár, the communist chief, was very successful in dividing, neutralizing, and atomizing the society. So we have this non-solidarity tradition, unlike Poland. And this is pretty well used now by the current government to make sure for the middle classes and the upper middle classes that they can continue a decent life. However, there are steps towards social exclusions, towards the lower classes, unemployed people, the Roma, refugees are treated as, you know, criminals, and also disabled people. And the ideology of the elite change is anti-communism, anti-liberalism, and anti-intellectualism at the same time. So a lot of anti, not that much positive statements, but a lot of negations justifying the need for radical elite change. And the Prime Minister conceptualized the great victory of 2010 as a revolution at the polling booth. So claiming that this is the will of this was the will of people, so we don't need to, you know, be bothering with, you know, rule of law, checks and balances, minor issues, long consultation about the new constitution. The will of people appeared in the spring of 2010, and that's it. So there is a cruel majoritarian understanding of democracy in order to justify the suspension of the rule of law. So from now, in the following 4 slides, I'd like to follow what Professor Gollner delivered from a theoretical point of view. To what extent these principles exist or does not exist, what are the shortcomings of these principles empirically in the Hungarian case. So we have a new constitution that was accepted in 2011, implemented from the 1st of January 2012, and it is called basic law or fundamental law. I use this fundamental law because it describes itself this way. This was simply discussed within 2 weeks and accepted by one party only, the Fidesz. And the Jobbik participated in the process but then did not vote for it. The left-wing opposition did not even participate in this. So it is not something that a broad consensus of the society. It is a one-sided constitution. As Prime Minister mentioned, the liberal constitution of 1989 now replaced by a Christian constitution of 2011. So he wanted to give finally an ideological justification of the new constitution, that this is based on collectivism, work, home, family, belonging, and Christianity. However, the conception of Christianity for Viktor Orbán is a bit different from the conception of Christianity of Pope Francis, for instance. So it's not sort of inclusive, broad, open understanding of Christianity, but rather a sort of exclusion, Christianity which can be used for social exclusion. So it's the God of Hungarians, not the love for all. So the fundamental law was modified several times to marginalize the Constitutional Court. I will return to this point later on. Private pension fund, which existed since 1997, was aggressively nationalized by the state. Union rights for strike were fundamentally restricted. Referendum, Fidesz, when it was in opposition in 2007, initiated a very successful referendum, a petition campaign, which undermined the legitimacy of the socialist liberal government. Now when Fidesz came to power, the first thing they did was to make referendums really near to impossible to initiate. In even some ways the private property were restricted, private property as something which needs to be defended as a principal thing of a liberal capitalist democracy, it is simply deleted from the constitution. So there is a parliament which is not about debates but stamping the initiatives of individual MPs who are acting in the name of the government. So there is a de facto, sociologically speaking, a de facto governing by decrees. And I should relentlessly underline the importance of the government control of the media. Digital divide is used, and I should remind you the secret of Vladimir Putin in the last 10 years, that he relied on the television and radio vis-à-vis the internet. Internet users in these societies are characteristically the younger people, and they still compose the minority of the society, not the majority. The majority still gets the information from the state-controlled television. I would not call it anymore public media, it is state media. There is a media authority which have broad powers to punish those channels and media outlets which can be considered as, saying some politically delicate thing. So it's very interesting that some, you know, in Western societies you have some devices to control the media content, you know, preventing children to watch pornographic films on TV. And the same regulation is used in Hungary for political content in some ways. So it's very strange that the regulation exists in other countries, but those are implanted in Hungary to have completely different circumstances and a different political intention. Second dimension, public scrutiny, justice. You know, there are very many important social institutions like the tax office, attorney general, the judiciary, the so-called counter-terrorist center, police. So all the institutional pillars formally exist, like the constitutional court. The problem is that these are operated under the control of those cronies who belong to the close circles of the prime minister. So therefore the tax office could be used politically against sometimes the opposition or against some business people, media outlets. The Attorney General is a former Fidesz person. Sometimes he is very quick to initiating a procedure. Sometimes he is breathtakingly slow. Tax benefits are also somehow arbitrarily designed. Somehow the regime makes difference between good families and bad families. Good families are those middle-class people with children. Those can get some tax restrictions and tax benefits, which is obviously not designed for the Roma or the underclass or for the unemployed. So it is not directly, I would not say this is a racist legislation. No, it is just a biased legislation. It is not said in the legal paragraphs. There were some efforts by the Budapest City Council to criminalize homelessness. There is some struggle on this. There are still elements of the rule of law in Hungary because sometimes the court can act against some unusually harsh decision of some legislative bodies. For instance, homelessness was criminalized and then the judiciary reversed this, so that's a good news, for instance. Right to protest against the government sometimes depend on the circumstances. So when the Chinese delegation visited Budapest, some people wanted to initiate a protest for Tibet, for the freedom of Tibet, but then simply the Prime Minister did not give approval for this, which is obviously against the law, but who cares, you know. And sometimes paramilitary units are used to restore order or to combat protesters, sometimes football hooligans who are close to some Fidesz leaders. One of them is the president of Ferencváros, football club with right-wing traditions. And there are particularly good relationships with these sort of combating non-military, non-police, but still potentially dangerous groups of people who can be used for the purposes of the government, even if the relationship can be judged as indirect. We don't know how the counter-terror center, Terror Elhárító Központ, is exactly used. You know, since George W. Bush, war on terror is high on the agenda globally. Therefore, not always democratic-minded leaders can easily use counter-terrorist measures for strengthening their own power. So actually abusing the original idea of a counter-terrorist activity. And There was a major change in the currency recently. The Swiss franc and the euro became much more expensive, and the forint, or Hungarian forint, was devaluated. A lot of people became bankrupt, and that was one of the reasons why Fidesz won the 2010 elections. But then, being on government, these indebted people were treated selectively again. Those who had enough money to pay back, those were given the opportunity. Others still pay back slowly, double, triple amount of money. It seems that there is no government willingness or capacity to defend effectively the rights of the Roma. And there is not much social security again. It is deleted from the constitution. Unemployment benefit is decreased, and there is no meaningful aid. The same story continues under the label of equality under the law. If you take a look on the electoral laws, there is a broad-scale gerrymandering which goes beyond the normal. I mean, gerrymandering exists everywhere in the world. It's not a big news, but the scale is different in Hungary. Also differentiations, as I said, between the so-called Trianon Hungarians who live in the historical Hungarian territories and other Hungarians who just recently left Hungary. They cannot vote in an envelope in written. They have to queue up in the consulate, on the embassies, and it is actually much more difficult for them to vote. I mean, it was also a huge scandal in Romania, and that led finally to the election to Klaus Iohannis, the Romanian president. As for the Hungarian president, it is, a parliamentary system, so the president is just a figurehead. But still, previous presidents had some sort of moral authority. Árpád Gönc, Ferenc Madl, László Sólyom, they exercised some sort of counterbalancing power based on their consistency, moral authority, and popularity. Pál Schmidt and János Áder are both coming from the Fidesz. They were Fidesz, that is governing party MPs, members of parliament, and particularly Pál Schmidt was absolutely proud to be not neutral. I mean, that was his constitutional obligation to be neutral. And he proudly declared that I am not going to be neutral. I will be the motor of the legislation and not the control of that. So it's a clear bias. Again, there are sometimes government campaigns against foreign-owned banks, campaigns against foreign investors and their businesses, sort of nationalist tones. It is again typical in populist discourse. Selective taxation of the media, also observable. There is the RTL Club. It's a foreign-owned television channel that used to be loyal to the government. Then the government decided to tax highly the RTL, and then the RTL decided to be more critical to the government, and the government decided to tax even more highly and more biased way the RTL, this media outlet. So there is no normative stance on both sides. It is just using the law in a discriminative way, which is, I think, highly problematic and really undermine the public trust to the rule of law. And also religions are, it used to be just a group of people decided now we belong to the same religious group. They went to the judiciary and it was registered automatically. Now they require a political approval. Now the parliament decides whether certain churches or religious communities can get some state approval or not. So it's a result of a political decision. How can the politic intervene to religious matters? It's a problem. And again, there is a new campaign against refugees. All of you remember the assassination of this caricature tabloid journal Charlie Hebdo in Paris. The Prime Minister visited Paris after and during the morning, and he, returning home, he started a campaign against refugees. And recently he said that all troubles are caused by the refugees, and Hungary should resist to the temptation to multiculturalism. It should be proud not to be multicultural, because multiculturalism undermines the identity of the nation. And refugees should be renamed as economic migrants. You know, if you hear this notion refugee, you have some sort of sympathy and solidarity towards those people. If it is renamed in the propaganda as economic migrants, then you probably think that those are greedy people. They just come to, you know, for better life and more money. So this is an interesting change in the political communication. Finally, judicial independence. I mean, one of the cornerstones of Hungarian rule of law was constitutional court. Now it is filled with pro-government people. It used to be 12 members, now 15 members. It is again a classic method for it was used in other countries to make it bigger and send cronies to the judiciary. The chairman of the Constitutional Court, now elected by the parliament. It used to be the judges who elected among themselves. And now it's filled with former Fidesz politicians and even some far-right figures. There is a constitutional ban. The Constitutional Court is forbidden to refer to its previous decisions as precedents. So the Constitutional Court was always very proud of the consistency of its decisions, and it is really an important tradition of rule of law and democratic tradition, I would even say, which we collected in these 2 decades of liberal democracy in Hungary. Now the court cannot refer to those decisions, so no precedent. It's a brave new word. You cannot think back to the 2000 previous period of time, and the judges cannot refer to this. So it's again like starting again a new chapter. The Constitution declared that the communist period did not belong to the national history. National history was interrupted. Nothing is valid which those legal acts which were done that time. So it is similar application to the liberal democratic period, very strange and paradoxical. The Supreme Court is under the control of the Prime Minister, family friend, and there was a purge of the judges. Those who were over 62-year-old, those were forced to retire in order to fill the positions with new people. Ombudsman was removed. After his removal, the office was restructured. And there was a recurrent government pressure on the judiciary. Sometimes in the press one can read explicit political expectations, but to the credit of the judiciary, they sometimes very proud to defend themselves. So it is an invisible struggle. So that is the rule of law. So what is the meaning of democracy if the rule of law is broken to that extent? So how can we define this? So we were very much preoccupied by institution building. It was very important to have a sophisticated democratic institution, and maybe the democratic deficit was that people did not trust democracy enough because they expected economic well-being from democracy, and they did not like democracy for itself, just if it delivers something. And so there was a democratic institution without the spirit of democracy, and this was abused by the populist discourse. An anti-elitist, anti-liberal, very populist discourse and discriminative legalism, as I described. Hugo Chavez, who died, used to rule Venezuela. he said famously sometime that to my friends I give everything, to my enemies the law. So this is discriminative legalism, you know, that it is not used for everybody on the same extent, but the law is used to punish those who are not the political friends. So Bálint Magyar and others, his followers, call this mafia state. I call it predatory state. So it's interesting to see there is a, I said, occupation of the state, but it's not a state capture because it's not from outside, it is from inside. And parallel, one can observe political and economic goals being reached and also to stay in power for long. And my final slide, the conclusions. Okay, we know many countries like this, you know, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, a lot of other countries, Albania, problems in Macedonia, problems in Serbia, but these countries are not members of the European Union. What makes the Hungarian case really unique, that this is a this is a European Union member state, which leader openly admires illiberal states and present as models for Hungary, Russia, China, Turkey, Azerbaijan, none of them democratic, none of them even half democratic, and it is presented by the European Union member state as a model. And also culture and education are politically homogenized. Aurel Kolnai once upon a time wrote a book on the interwar period and the rise of fascism under the title The War Against the West. It's somehow a sort of ironic war, because it cannot be taken fully seriously. War against Western multiculturalism, against cultural diversity, feminism, minority rights, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth. And there are open borders, you know, there is no iron curtain, everybody can freely leave the country, still there is ethnocentrism and xenophobia. So my conclusion is that it is a very paradoxical situation. As a member state, Hungary receives a lot of money, a lot of funds from the European Union. And this high linkage with the West, which was used to democratize the country 10 years ago, now it is used to the opposite purpose, to make those circles rich who are close to the Prime Minister. So actually the Western taxpayers, the European Union citizens, they sponsoring the economic stability of a regime which disrespects the European values. It is a problem of Europe. The European Union does not sanction non-democratic policies of a member state effectively. For some reason they are shy away, they are clumsy, they are slow, they have the Lisbon Treaty, there is the European Commission, the Parliament, the European Council, the Copenhagen criteria, very high threshold for new member states, but once you are within the club, you can do whatever you want. So, and then the Union doesn't have mechanisms. There is no Copenhagen Committee yet, as Jan Vermeer Müller proposed. So my conclusion, last sentence, that why is it interesting? It is not just because Hungary is interesting, a small country. I mean, it's clear that the West is much more concerned with Russia, Putin, the conflict in Ukraine, the Ukrainian situation, Turkey, or the economic crisis in Greece. But the Hungarian political crisis can be a dangerous one potentially if other countries like Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, Croatia follow the same example. If it is not tackled properly, then the Hungarian problem is going to be a European problem. Thank you.
Thank you.